The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the steady beat of drums echoing faintly in the distance. The land stretched wide beneath the moon, shadows of tall pines swaying in the wind as if they were whispering secrets to one another. It was a time when every sound carried weight, when every movement in the dark could mean danger or destiny. Somewhere deep within those woods, fate was preparing to entwine two souls who never asked to be bound, yet could not escape what was coming. The widow had not chosen this life. Once she had lived with laughter around her table, the warmth of a husband's voice, and the safety of knowing her children would have a father's guiding hand. But death is ruthless, and it came for him too soon, leaving her with nothing but grief and the heavy burden of survival. She was strong in her silence, carrying water, tending to the land, caring for her little ones, and enduring the whispers of neighbors who pitied her misfortune. Yet behind her quiet eyes was a woman who feared what the coming seasons might bring. For the world around her was changing fast, and danger often came without warning. He appeared one evening, a figure broad and fierce, his face cut sharp by the glow of firelight. He was a Cheyenne warrior, and everything about him spoke of power. His stance, the scars that told of battles fought, and the eyes that burned with something no ordinary man could carry. His people had lived through storms of loss, pushed from their lands, hunted, and forced to fight for every inch of existence. He carried that weight within him, a storm ready to break at any moment. To see him was to feel both awe and unease, as though nature itself had stepped into human form. Their meeting was not gentle. It was a clash of two worlds, hers, carved by sorrow and survival, his by honor and fire. She looked at him with both fear and defiance, unwilling to bow to anyone, even a man whose very presence commanded the air around him. He, in turn, studied her with a hunger that went beyond the flesh. It was the hunger of a man who had lost too much, who sought to reclaim not just what had been taken from his people, but what had been denied him personally. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, was low and edged with something primal. "Your body is mine," he growled, "until I have my sons." The words struck her like thunder. They were not a request, not a plea, but a declaration, sharp as an arrow loosed from the bow. She froze, her breath caught, torn between disbelief and outrage. Sons, he spoke of children not yet born, of a bond she had not agreed to, of a future that seemed both terrifying and unavoidable. For a moment her heart pounded so loud she thought it would burst from her chest. She wanted to run, to scream, to fight back, but something in his eyes held her still. It was not cruelty she saw there, nor simple lust. It was something more complicated, something tangled between grief, duty, and an unshakable resolve. The widow felt the earth tilt beneath her. She was a woman who had already buried her dreams once, who had already been forced to live in a world shaped by men's choices. Now, standing before this warrior, she realized she was being pulled into another storm, one that could shatter what little peace she had managed to hold together. Yet there was also a flicker deep within her, one she refused to name, a spark that came with his nearness. With the way his presence filled the air like fire filling a cold room, the warrior did not step closer. Not yet. He simply stood, his jaw set, his voice lingering in her mind like smoke that would not clear. He carried with him a weight of tradition, of promises to his ancestors, of survival that demanded sacrifice. To him, sons were not just children. They were legacy bloodlines that carried the strength of a people who refused to vanish. He believed the spirits had led him here, to her, and that their union was written long before either of them had spoken a word. She wanted to believe she still had a choice. But in the quiet of that night, with his words still burning in the air, she knew nothing would ever be the same. The widow's chest rose and fell with the force of her breath, her hands trembling though she tried to still them. Could she resist him? Could she fight what seemed already decided? Or would she find herself swept into the current of his will, caught between her own freedom and the destiny he carved with every word he spoke? Outside, the wind grew stronger, rattling the shutters of her small home, carrying with it the cry of a wolf from the distance. It was as if the earth itself answered to the tension between them, nature bearing witness to the moment when two lives collided and the balance of both would never return to what it once was. Her children stirred in the other room, innocent and unaware of the storm rising just beyond their door. The warrior's gaze softened for just a breath, almost as if he, too, felt the weight of what he had said. But then his jaw tightened once more, and the fire in his eyes flared back to life. She could see he was not a man who bent, not one who wavered. His word was iron, his spirit unbroken, his claim undeniable. Her lips parted, but no words came. The air between them was thick, every heartbeat stretching into eternity. She wanted to demand answers, to cry out against his vow, to remind him that her body was her own. But when her eyes met his, she found herself silent, caught by something ancient and untamed in his expression. The widow stood trembling, her world tilting toward a path she had never imagined. While the warrior's shadow loomed long against the firelight, the night held its breath, waiting for what would come next. And in that breathless silence, one truth became clear. This was only the beginning. Would she resist him, or would destiny claim her as fiercely as the warrior had? The answer was not yet written. The drums in the distance grew louder, echoing across the dark land, promising that the storm between them had only just begun. The widow could hardly sleep that night. The words of the Cheyenne warrior circled her mind like restless birds that refused to land. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the firelight glinting against his sharp cheekbones, the shadows cutting across his face, and the unwavering certainty in his gaze. His voice lingered too, heavy and unshakable, as though the earth itself had spoken through him. She told herself she would not bend, she would not allow her life to be stolen again by another man's will. But even as she whispered those promises into the silence of her small cabin, a tremor of doubt ran through her heart. Long before her husband's death, she had lived with caution. The frontier was no place for softness, no place for women to hide behind comfort. There were threats from every side, harsh winters, hunger, sickness that could sweep away a family overnight, and the constant shadow of conflict between settlers and the tribes who had walked this land long before. Cabins and fences marked the soil. She remembered the way her husband used to speak of the Cheyenne with both respect and wariness. They were not like others, he would say. Proud, fierce, bound to traditions that outsiders could never fully understand. And now here stood one of them, not as a passing shadow, but as a storm breaking directly upon her. The warrior himself carried his own ghosts. He had not chosen this path simply to claim a woman for his keeping. His people had endured years of broken promises, land stripped from them, and battles that left fathers buried and sons scattered to the wind. He had grown into manhood with the knowledge that survival meant more than food or shelter. It meant carrying forward the bloodline, ensuring that the names of his people would not vanish into silence. For him, sons were not just flesh and blood. They were the living bond between the past and the future, the only defense against erasure. When he looked at the widow, he saw more than her pale hands worn from work, more than her weary eyes. He saw strength hidden beneath her grief, the kind of endurance that had carried her through storms already. She was not meek, not broken despite her loss. And perhaps that was why the spirits had led him to her door. To him, it was not chance. It was destiny calling him to lay claim, to forge something that neither the cold winters nor the enemies of his people could tear down. The widow, however, did not see destiny. She saw a threat to what little peace she had left. Her children were still young, their lives tender and fragile, untouched by the darker truths of the world. She feared what this man's presence might mean for them. Could she shield them from his command, or would his shadow stretch across their days until they, too, were claimed by his will? Yet in the quiet corners of her heart, she also felt something she could not name. Not love, not even attraction, but a strange recognition, as if some part of her had always known that life would test her in ways she could never prepare for. Days passed with unease. The warrior lingered, though not in the way of an intruder. He did not storm her home or demand her surrender at every hour. Instead, he appeared at the edges of her world, helping to split wood without being asked, carrying heavy pails of water from the stream, mending a fence post that had leaned for weeks. Each act was simple, yet it unsettled her more than threats would have. She wanted to believe he was softening, that perhaps his vow had been only the outburst of a proud man in a moment of fire. But every time his eyes found hers, she remembered his words, "Until I have my sons." The neighbors began to notice. Whispers spread like dry grass catching flame. Some said she had taken him in willingly, that grief had driven her to find comfort in forbidden arms. Others warned that his presence would bring trouble. No peace could come from a bond forged between a widow of the settlers and a warrior of the Cheyenne. Their words pressed against her like stones in her chest, but she kept her silence. What could she say? That she had not chosen this? That destiny had stepped into her life uninvited. The warrior ignored the whispers. He was used to being watched, judged, and feared. For him, the eyes of others mattered little compared to the voice of the spirits that guided him. Still, he was not blind to the danger his presence created. He knew there were men in the settlement who looked at him with hate, hands twitching near their rifles whenever he passed. He did not fear them, but he knew the widow's world was fragile, and his shadow upon it was growing heavier with each day. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and painted the sky with fire, the widow sat by her small hearth, her children asleep in the next room. She thought of her late husband, of his laughter, his strength, and the promises they once whispered of a simple, quiet life. She wept softly, her shoulders shaking in the firelight. And then she felt it, the warrior's presence at the doorway. He stood silent, watching, his face unreadable. For a moment she wanted to scream at him to leave her be, to let her grieve in peace. But when her eyes met his, she found no mockery, no triumph. Only something heavy, something broken. Hidden behind the mask of a man who never showed weakness, that glimpse unsettled her more than his vow. Because in that fleeting moment she saw that he, too, carried grief that could never be erased. Perhaps not the same as hers, but deep enough to carve shadows in his soul. Still, the tension between them did not soften. If anything, it grew sharper, like a blade waiting for the moment to strike. She feared that each day brought her closer to a choice she did not want to make. Would she defy him and risk the storm his anger might bring? Or would she bend against every cry of her spirit and let herself be swept into his destiny? The nights grew longer, the air colder, the drums in the distance louder. Rumors spoke of unrest, of more conflict stirring between the settlers and the Cheyenne. The widow's world felt like a tinderbox, waiting for one spark to set it aflame. And through it all, the warrior's vow remained unbroken, a shadow that loomed over her days and haunted her nights. Each glance, each silence, each word left unsaid built the weight higher. Something was coming, something neither of them could stop. The days that followed carried a strange weight. The widow woke each morning to the sound of her children's laughter, but her heart was never at ease. Every shadow outside the cabin door reminded her of the warrior. Every gust of wind seemed to carry his presence. He did not force himself upon her, but neither did he leave. Instead, he lingered, steady and patient, as if he knew time itself would push her closer to him. The settlement began to stir with unease. Men gathered at the trading post and muttered in low voices about the Cheyenne warrior seen too often near her land. Some called him a danger, a scout watching for weakness before an attack. Others said he had bewitched the widow, twisting her loyalty against her own people. She heard their whispers when she fetched flour and salt, saw the way their eyes narrowed on her, as if she carried betrayal in her very skin. Yet when she returned home, she found him there, working silently with an axe, or sitting by the fire as if the land itself had made room for him. Her children grew used to his presence faster than she did. They watched him with wide eyes, curious, unafraid. He taught her oldest boy how to set a snare, how to read tracks in the dirt, how to listen to the calls of birds for signs of danger. At first she tried to stop him, her voice sharp with fear. But the boy's face lit with pride each time he learned something new, and slowly she stopped speaking. Her daughter brought him small gifts, a wildflower, a shiny stone from the creek. Things a child's heart found valuable. The warrior never smiled, not truly, but his eyes softened when he accepted them. It unsettled the widow, this slow weaving of her children into his shadow. Beyond her cabin, tensions were rising. News drifted in of skirmishes further west, of farms raided and camps burned. The settlers armed themselves, their hands never far from their rifles, their tempers as quick as dry tinder. The Cheyenne, too, were restless, their patience worn thin by broken promises. The warrior carried that unrest within him, though he rarely spoke of it. She could feel it in him, like thunder trapped inside a mountain, waiting for the right moment to break. At night, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling beams while the fire burned low. She thought of her late husband and wondered what he would think of all this. Would he see the warrior as a threat, a danger to be driven out? Or would he recognize the weight of survival that pressed on both of them? The widow did not know. All she knew was that her world was no longer her own, and she was caught between two fires that threatened to consume everything she loved. The warrior, for his part, did not speak often of his past, but fragments slipped through like cracks in stone. She learned of a brother lost in battle, of a promise made to his father to carry forward the bloodline, of the children buried before they had the chance to walk. His grief was a shadow as heavy as her own, and in rare moments, when their eyes met across the fire, she felt that grief binding them together in ways neither had chosen. But her neighbors saw none of this. To them, he was only a threat. One evening, as she walked back from the stream, she overheard two men speaking in harsh whispers behind the trading post. They spoke of driving him off, of making sure he never returned. One even spoke of killing him outright. The widow froze, her heart racing, torn between relief at the thought of being free from his claim and fear for what such an act might unleash. She knew the warrior was not a man to die quietly, and blood spilled would bring more blood in return. The children noticed her unease, though she tried to hide it. Her son asked one night if the warrior would stay with them forever. She did not answer. Instead, she told him to sleep, though she herself could not rest. The question lingered in her mind. Would he stay forever? Or would the storm gathering outside finally pull him away or crash down upon them all? Meanwhile, the warrior's own people were watching him. Rumors reached his ears that some within his band questioned his choice. They wondered why he lingered among settlers, why he bound himself to a woman not of his blood. Some saw it as betrayal, others as weakness. For him, it was neither. He believed the spirits had led him to her, that her strength and her children's innocence were part of the path laid before him. Yet he could not ignore the growing divide between his duty to his people and the vow he had made. The widow felt it too. Each day she carried water, tended to her children, and kept her eyes fixed on the horizon. Every sunrise might bring peace, or it might bring ruin. She did not know which would come first. All she knew was that her life was no longer simple, no longer safe. The warrior's presence had tied her fate to something far larger than her own small world, and there was no turning back. One night, when the wind howled through the pines and the fire cracked low, she asked him quietly why he had chosen her. For a long moment, he said nothing, only stared into the flames as if searching for words buried deep. At last he spoke, his voice low and steady. "Because the spirits showed me strength in your eyes. Because you will not break." The words left her shaken. Strength had carried her this far, yes, but strength was also the weight she bore alone every day. She had never asked for this destiny, never asked to be chosen. And yet here she was, with the storm pressing ever closer, knowing that the path ahead would demand more of her than she had ever given before. The drums in the distance grew louder that week, echoing across the hills like the heartbeat of the earth. The widow could feel the world shifting, pulling her deeper into a conflict she could not escape. Each moment stretched tight with suspense, every silence thick with the promise of what was yet to come. The air grew colder as autumn crept in, sharpening the nights and thinning the patience of everyone around her. The widow felt it in her bones, a heaviness that pressed against her each morning when she stepped outside and saw the mist hanging low across the fields. The warrior's presence was no longer a quiet shadow on the edge of her life. It had become the center of her days, a force she could not escape. She tried to keep her head down when she went into the settlement, but the stares followed her, sharper now, voices bolder. Men spoke of danger openly, their hands brushing the grips of their rifles, as though the thought of violence was never far. The warrior sensed it too. He stood taller, his eyes always scanning, his body always ready. He said little, but she could feel the storm inside him. At night he would sit by the fire, his face carved from stone, and she wondered what battles he was fighting in his mind. He had told her once that his people had lost too much already, that he would not see them weaken further. Now she could see the weight of that promise in the set of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. He was a man standing between two worlds, and both were pulling at him with relentless force. Her children grew restless with the tension. Her son asked if there would be fighting, if their home would be burned like the stories whispered among the other children in the settlement. She had no answers for him. Her daughter clung to her skirts more often, watching the warrior with wide, questioning eyes. They felt the coming storm, even if they could not name it. One evening, as the sky bled red with the setting sun, riders appeared on the ridge, settlers' rifles strapped across their backs, their silhouettes sharp against the fading light. The widow's breath caught as she watched them from her cabin door. They did not come closer that night, only lingered like shadows that refused to leave. The message was clear enough. They were watching, waiting. She turned and saw the warrior standing behind her, his hand resting near the knife at his belt, his eyes locked on the ridge. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was louder than any words could be. The pressure grew with each passing day. Food was harder to find, tempers in the settlement shorter. The men spoke openly now of driving the warrior out. Some spoke of fire, others of bullets. She heard them, and though part of her wanted him gone, fear twisted her stomach at the thought of what would happen if they tried. The warrior was no easy prey, and his people were not far. One spark could set everything ablaze. Meanwhile, word reached the warrior that his own kin were losing patience. They questioned his absence, his choice to linger among settlers, his silence in the face of growing threats. Some wanted him back at their side, prepared for battle. Others whispered that his heart had been captured by the widow, that he was no longer loyal to his blood. He told her none of this directly, but she saw it in the way his eyes darkened when the drums carried across the hills at night. He was being pulled apart, torn between duty and desire, between the past that bound him and the future that haunted him. The widow lay awake each night, her chest tight with dread. She thought of her husband's grave, of the vows they once shared, and wondered if she was betraying his memory by allowing this man to remain in her home. Yet at the same time, she could not deny the strange safety she felt when the warrior stood nearby, the sense that no harm could reach her children while his shadow lingered across their doorway. It was a safety laced with fear, protection that came at the cost of freedom. Tension boiled over one night when a stone shattered the cabin window. The children screamed, the firelight flickering across their frightened faces. The widow rushed to shield them while the warrior stepped into the doorway, scanning the darkness. Voices carried from the trees, angry, harsh, promising that the end was near. The widow's heart pounded as she clutched her children, and for the first time she saw rage flicker across the warrior's face. His patience had thinned to breaking, his vow carved deeper now, not only in his voice, but in his very stance. He turned to her, his eyes burning with something fierce, something unyielding. "The storm is here," he said quietly, as if the night itself needed to hear. And she knew then that the waiting was over. The battle, whether of blood or spirit, was no longer a distant threat. It was upon them. The following days stretched taut like a bowstring. Riders circled closer, the drums in the hills grew louder, and the widow felt trapped between two forces crashing toward one another. Her neighbors looked at her with suspicion, as though she herself carried the blame. Her children clung tighter, their laughter fading into silence. Even the land seemed to hold its breath, the wind colder, the nights longer. The silence before dawn unbearable. Every choice she made, every glance at the warrior, every whisper from the settlement or the distant hills pressed down harder. Something had to break. The widow could feel it in her bones. The climax of all their struggles was near. Whether it would end in fire, blood, or something else entirely, she did not know. But as she looked into the warrior's eyes one last time that night, she saw no fear there, only the unshakable resolve of a man who had made a vow and would see it through to the end, no matter the cost. The night of the storm arrived with no warning. The wind howled through the pines, carrying the sound of drums from the distant hills and the sharp echo of hooves against frozen ground. The widow stood at her door, clutching her children close, while the warrior tightened his grip on the knife at his side. The settlement had grown restless beyond reason, and the Cheyenne, too, had lost patience. Both sides seemed ready to strike, and her cabin stood caught in the middle. It began with voices shouting in the dark. Settlers had come, their lanterns glowing like angry eyes moving through the trees. The widow's heart pounded as she recognized some of the men. Neighbors she had known for years, their faces twisted now with suspicion and fear. They called for the warrior to come out, demanded that he leave and never return. Their words carried threats, their hands rested heavy on rifles. The warrior stepped forward, his body calm but unyielding. He said nothing at first, only stood as the wind tore at his hair and the firelight caught the hard lines of his face. The widow wanted to cry out, to beg them all to stop, but her voice froze in her throat. She feared that any sound would shatter the fragile balance. Holding the night together, then came another sound, the steady beat of horses approaching from the opposite side. From the shadows emerged warriors of the Cheyenne, their faces painted, their eyes sharp with anger. They too had come to claim him, to remind him where his loyalty lay. The widow's cabin, her land. Her children, all of it, had become the meeting ground of two storms colliding. Her son clung to her skirt, whispering that he was afraid, while her daughter buried her face against her chest. She held them tightly, her eyes darting from the settlers to the Cheyenne, from one side to the other, realizing that any spark could ignite bloodshed. The warrior stood between them, his body straight, his gaze fixed on both enemies and kin alike. For a long breath, no one moved. The world seemed to hang in silence, broken only by the groan of the wind. Then the warrior raised his voice, steady and deep, carrying across the clearing. He spoke of loss, of battles fought, of graves filled too soon. He spoke of the widow, of her strength, of the children who needed a future that could not be carved from hate. His words were not a plea but a command, spoken with the fire of conviction. The settlers shifted uneasily, their rifles still in hand, but their faces wavering. Some muttered under their breath, others lowered their eyes. They had come seeking an enemy, but now found themselves facing a man who would not bow, yet who did not call for blood. On the other side, the Cheyenne warriors listened with dark eyes, torn between anger and respect. They knew his vow, knew the spirits that guided him. The widow held her breath, waiting for the break, for the violence she feared would tear her world apart. But instead, the night seemed to bend under the weight of his words. One by one, the settlers backed away, their anger cooling into silence. The Cheyenne, too, turned their horses, leaving him to stand in the firelight with only the wind and the widow's eyes upon him. When the last lantern faded into the dark and the drums fell quiet in the distance, the widow finally let out the breath she had been holding. Her children clung tighter, trembling with relief. The warrior turned to her then, his face still shadowed, but his eyes softer than she had ever seen. He had stood against both worlds, not for conquest, but for something greater than either side could see. In the days that followed, the settlement grew quieter. The whispers did not stop, but the threat of violence drifted away like smoke after a fire. The settlers no longer dared to challenge the widow openly, and the Cheyenne, too, seemed to respect the warrior's choice, even if they did not fully understand it. Life began to settle into a fragile rhythm, as though the storm had passed but left behind scars in the earth. The widow found herself walking through her days with a new awareness. The warrior did not vanish from her life, nor did he press his vow upon her, as he once had. Instead, he worked beside her, helping with the harvest, teaching her children, standing guard when the nights grew long and uneasy. She began to see him not as a force that had stolen into her world, but as a man carrying his own grief, his own burdens, not unlike her own. Her son grew stronger under his guidance, learning skills that would keep him alive in a harsh land. Her daughter grew braver, no longer hiding in fear but stepping forward with questions, laughter, and gifts of wildflowers. The widow herself began to see change within. She had carried loss for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to stand with another who understood that pain. Though she did not speak it aloud, she felt something shift, a fragile bond forming in the quiet spaces between them as winter approached. The land hardened with frost, and the nights grew longer still. Yet the widow no longer felt as alone as she once had. The warrior remained, his presence steady. His vow no longer a chain, but a promise that bound them in ways neither had expected. Their lives had been shaped by sorrow, by conflict, by forces far beyond their choosing. But together they had endured, and together they would face whatever storms came next. The children played in the snow, their laughter echoing through the trees. And for the first time in many months, the widow felt hope stir within her chest. She looked to the warrior, saw him watching with the faintest trace of a smile, and realized that their story was no longer one of loss alone. It was a story of survival, of strength, of two worlds colliding and yet finding a way to stand side by side. The vow he had spoken that first night would always echo in her memory, but its meaning had shifted. It was no longer a command etched in fire, but a truth forged in endurance, that their lives were bound not by force, but by the will to keep moving forward in a world that tried to break them. And so the widow carried on. Her days marked by the rhythm of work, the sound of her children's voices, and the quiet presence of the warrior who had stepped into her life like a storm and remained like a mountain. She knew the future would bring trials still, but she also knew that whatever came, she would not face it alone. The story of the widow and the Cheyenne warrior lingered in whispers across the land, carried by wind, by firelight, by the hearts of those who heard it. Some called it strange, others called it fate, but for her, it was simply life hard, unrelenting, yet filled with moments that made survival worth the struggle. In the end, the storm had not destroyed her, it had remade her. And as the snow fell softly across the cabin roof, and the horizon glowed with the promise of dawn, she understood at last that strength was not just in enduring, but in allowing hope to return, even after all seemed lost.